All right, ladies and gentlemen. Let's take just a moment here and run through some prayer updates and lists on behalf of the church. Tonight we have a little bit of a special event. I'll explain a little bit more in just a moment, but we are going to have a brief devotional thought provided to us by Graydon McCreary tonight. So we're going to get to that as quick as we can. But before we do that, let's talk about some prayer updates and requests. Obviously, let's continue to pray for Roy's family. Roy Heflin, after his passing, rather unexpectedly. He had such an impact on so many people in our congregation. So let's just continue to pray for that family. On a personal note and an extended church note, everyone's sick right now. Like everyone. I got text after text from teens who are going to be here tonight because they have cold. My whole family, both daughters and wife, have a cold. Oh yeah, she's okay. She's just sniffling. But so just prayers up for a lot of the people that are sick right now. Even in our teen event tonight, there was sniffles all over the place. So stay healthy out there. Prayers for people to recover quickly and well. See, there we go. That's what I'm telling you. What else can we pray for tonight? Anybody sick, updates, things like that on behalf of the family? Yes. One of your teachers is leaving? Where is she going? Oh, what's her name? No, not the mother, the teacher. Miss Jen? Okay, yeah, we'll pray for Miss Jen. For those of you who couldn't hear, Jade has a teacher named Miss Jen who's going to be leaving for a bit because her mother passed away. Yes, Riley? Yeah, prayers for the teachers in this time of transition. That's always scary. Let's, also I'd like to throw out on the prayer request list a continued prayer for Joe Pate. For those of you who have been following the Joe Pate saga, he has been up and down, better and worse, but pretty much consistently in pain for the better part of over a year now. They just did another procedure not too long ago, and they're monitoring him closely. Just prayers for relief. Anyone who's experienced chronic pain for as long as he has understands the weight that can bear on your soul, just bringing you down and making life difficult. So let's continue to pray for Joe, as well as Jeff Carter. I don't know how many of you guys have talked to Jeff. Jeff is a newer member of our church. He's been here for about 6 to 8 months now. Him and his wife and his daughter Jaden. Great family, awesome. He had an injury that caused him to lose a ridiculous amount of blood. Very scary moments. Thought he was going to pass away. Didn't think he was going to make it. Got to talk to Jeff at length a couple Sundays ago. If you haven't had a conversation with that man, you need to. His view and outlook on life is amazing. He was talking about how he was sitting there covered in his own blood. He was losing it. They were about to do another transfusion. And he kind of had come to terms with the fact that he was going to die. And his response was, he said a prayer and he said, God, forgive me of all my sins, because I know I have a lot of them, but I fully trust in you. And I just thought to myself, what an amazing testament of faith that I think all of us can learn from. He seems to be recovering well. The doctors are very good on his prognosis. In fact, when they released him from the hospital, this is another kind of cool story. My dad went and prayed with him on a Wednesday at 2 o'clock. 2 days later, they released him fully, and his vitals stabilized after the prayer session. The doctor actually walked into Jeff's room and opened the dialogue by saying, do you believe in God? And Jeff said yes, and then he told him that story. So God was all over that process, and that's just such a beautiful thing. With that being said, still very scary, and there is still a hole in his small intestine that is present. So he's not out of the woods yet, but he is recovering well. So let's continue to pray for Jeff. Any other people in our... Oh, Norman. Oh, okay. What happened to Dave? Oh, okay. Dave is our neighbor, but he is basically an extended part of the Darby family. He comes over every Friday night and plays a board game with Dad and I and Chase in the garage. Axis and Allies, for those of you who are nerds. But it's, so he's a good friend of ours, but we'll definitely be keeping him in our prayers. Okay, any other prayer requests before we pass it on over to Graydon? Yeah.
So Connie Abel has been on our prayer list for a while. She's my girl's aunt, and she was supposed to have treatments starting up for her cancer, pancreatic cancer, but her hemoglobin is too low again. They wanted to transfuse her, and she put a post on Facebook today that says, "Please give blood. You could be saving a life." So I don't know if something is hidden in there, like I don't want to.
Sure.
But
So Connie Abel is her name?
If we're short on blood, I'll do it.
Yeah, for sure. Connie Abel is the name that was just brought up for those of you who couldn't hear. This is Linda's daughter's aunt. She has pancreatic cancer and is in need of blood, but her hemoglobin levels aren't high enough for her to get it presently. So keep praying for her and her recovery. By the way, this is a process that anyone who's experienced long-term cancer, this is sadly very common, and it's hard. It's really, really hard. Yeah. Oh, what's his name? Trevor? Yeah, absolutely, man. So your dad got in a car accident? What did he say? I couldn't hear the last one. A little bit better. Good. We'll still keep praying, man. That's scary. For sure. I'm sorry, Miss Linda. I had already started, and then I heard you. I didn't want to cut you off.
I just thought it was worth mentioning that she has already, and I know it's from our multiple prayers that have been going up, she's already surpassed what the doctors thought she was going to live.
That's good to hear.
So
For those of you who couldn't hear that, this woman, Connie Abel, was given a shorter timeline and has continually passed it by prayers of the church and others. So continue to pray for her that she can continue to overcome and hopefully find not only life, but a quality of life that's worth living. Okay, if that's all the prayer updates that we have, I'm going to lead us in a quick prayer. Then I'm going to hand it over to Graydon, and he's going to give us a little devotional thought, and then we'll dismiss for class. Let's pray. Father, we come before you now thankful for the chance that we have to come together, to study your word, to learn about you. Lord, there is so many things that are constantly on our minds, so many ways that the world tries to distract us and pull us here or there with anxieties and worries and concerns. Perhaps there is no time that's clearer than these last couple weeks have been, with the political cycle and all of the voices yelling out anger and hate and frustration and whatever. We ask, Lord, that you allow us as your children to be beyond that and above that, to greet the world with love and respect, regardless of what's going on around us, to live at peace with all people. Lord, we ask that you be with a variety of people that are on our hearts and our minds right now. Roy Heflin and his passing, his family as they try to recover. We ask for Miss Jen, the loss of her mom. We ask for the prayers of many teachers who are fearful right now in this time. We ask that you be with Joe in his consistent battle with pain management, and Jeff after his scary, scary situation. But Lord, we applaud his faith and the example that he is to so many of us. We ask that you be with Dave and his leg and his injury, Trevor and his recovery from his car accident, and Connie and her constant battle with cancer. Lord, there are so many others that we could have mentioned, people that are on our hearts and on our minds, names that are running across our head right now. We just raise them up to you. We ask all this in your son's name. Amen. Tonight's going to be a little bit of a different devotional topic. We had a debate amongst our youth group, broke them into two groups, and the debate was the deadliest weapon of the Bible. They reached in, pulled out a random item of sorts, and then had to put together a debate where they researched and were able to express it. Graydon's team, though lost the debate, had a really good insight and kind of a powerful thought as he presented an idea on Shamgar's ox code, a random story out of Judges. I'd like for him to share the thought that his group had, and then we'll dismiss you for class. Graydon, come on up.
So our group had the ox goad of Shamgar. It was like, what's an ox goad? So in Judges chapter 3, verse 31, it says, Shamgar the son of Anath was the next rescue of Israel. In one battle he used one sharp wooden pole to kill 600 Philistines. So this guy's just walking around with a stick, just going to kill a whole bunch of Philistines. And it was interesting to see about like how his faith was probably the most deadliest weapon that was given. It wasn't really the actual weapon that was being used, it was his faith, because he used the faith that God gave him to use a stick to go and fight the Philistines.
Okay, guys, you are dismissed. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's go ahead and get started. Not going to lie to you, if you have already seen the title of tonight's class, you'll know why I feel particularly not qualified to teach this class. It's entitled The Pain of Childbirth. Though I've seen it up close and personal just a couple of weeks ago, I have, thank goodness, never experienced it, and also, thank goodness, never will. But we are not going to be dropping into that specifically, but more of a bigger narrative on something else. I'd like to take just a moment, and it's been a couple of weeks since we've gotten together. Last week we had a special one-off Halloween class, and so I'd like us to kind of regroup, bring us all back to where we are, and kind of prepare for what is the conclusion of our class together. A couple of weeks ago, we introduced how the entire story of the Bible can be told in 3 women. The entire story of the Bible in 3 women. And we introduced the first of these 3 women in Genesis chapters 1 through 3. God creates the world, but then emphasizes the creation of man and of woman. This first woman received a name in Hebrew, Aisha. We, I think, poorly translate it, woman, which is very confusing because it's not the actual word for woman, it's the name that's slightly different. But either way, God gave her this name, woman. This word literally means the genuine one, the one who is going to deliver mankind. Not only that, but God gave her a title. This title was called Ezer, or deliverer. And she was the one responsible for carrying on God's dream of creation to the next generation. The problem was, that dream never came to fruition because in Genesis chapter 3, she found herself at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and Satan, identifying that she was a massive threat, decided to target her with the first temptation. As the story goes, she fell victim to his trick, ate of the fruit, and sin entered the world. On the moment that sin entered the world, something tragic happened. Adam, her husband, gave her a new name. No longer was she Aisha, the name that God gave her, woman, but he gave her another name, the name Eve, or in Hebrew, Kava. This is one of the most insulting moments of the Bible. The name Eve, though kind of translated mother of all, is also the same root word for the word snake, a reminder of Eve's mistake. What's also interesting is that God never acknowledged the name change. Though Adam and all future generations would call Eve, Eve, God always called her Aisha, revealing that he never gave up on her, even after sin. He knew that that woman that he made was still there, buried, admittedly, behind layers of failure. And that right there is where we're going to kind of jump into the story. I do want to say this also, because I think this is kind of cool. Pick anything you want in the Bible and pull it hard enough and it'll lead you to Jesus Christ. That's one of the most remarkable things about the Bible. I've talked about this before. The reason I'm so confident in my faith is I don't have a very emotional relationship with God. A lot of people can point to moments, right, where like they felt like God did something profound. That's never been me. This is what convinces me that God is real. And it's the fact that I have pored over the Bible so many times, sometimes to prove it, sometimes to disprove it, sometimes because I wanted to be strengthened, sometimes because I wanted so desperately for God not to be a thing that I had to follow. And time again, no matter how hard I pull the threads, it always leads me back to Jesus, constantly. In 2022, on a Lumberjack Sunday, for those of you who are not familiar with Lumberjack Sunday, it's the single greatest event Marysville Church of Christ does every year. We all wear buffalo plaid, come together, and do tree stuff. Why? Why not? We usually eat some food. There's often very good food. But we also do a sermon that Sunday on trees. In 2022, we did one called The Gospel in 3 Trees. And we told the entire story of the Bible in trees. In 2021, we did the same kind of thing on the 4th of July, where we told the story of the Bible using 3 kings. My point, pick anything you want. Women, trees, kings, boats, arcs, water, rivers, fruit, whatever. Pick any motif, start pulling, and guess where it'll lead you? Right to the foot of the cross, just the way God designed it. So, tonight, we're going to continue our journey of 3 women, telling the Bible in 3 women. The first woman, Aisha, representing the fall of man, sin, and its way that it impacts us. There's also one other thing I want to say, and this is something Madison made me add. Bottom of page 1, I use this word a lot, and she's like, you got to stop using this word if you're not going to define it. And I was like, ooh, my bad. So tonight we're defining it. There are two words I use a lot in classes, bottom of page 1. It's called types and antitypes. Top of page 2 kind of has some definitions there for you. Basically, it's this. A type is a foreshadow of something. The antitype is what that thing is foreshadowing. To give you an example, we had a couple weeks ago a class where we talked about the Ark of the Covenant. You know, the one from Indiana Jones. And also the Bible. Mainly the Bible. But one of the best Indiana Jones movies. Thank you. Yes. Anyway, so this box is a type. It pointed to something in the future. It wasn't the thing it was supposed to fulfill. It was just a foreshadow. The thing that came was Mary. Mary was the fulfillment of the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark was the type that pointed like a signpost to Mary, the antitype. By the way, we could do this with so many things. Couldn't we? Like the Passover lamb in the Old Testament. The Passover lamb is a signpost that leads you to the ultimate Lamb of God, Jesus, time and again. So if I say that tonight, I think I tried to pull a lot of that out, but just in case, that's what I mean. Cool. Let's jump back into the story, Genesis chapter 3. If you're following along in your own Bible, kind of keep that Genesis 3 text open. We're going to be flipping back and forth. For those of you who have the notes, literally every Bible verse that we'll have tonight will be on here, including some we don't actually read. Okay. So we left off the story with Aisha taking of the fruit, getting her name changed to Eve, and sin kind of flowing into the world in a massive way. As we'll see throughout the text of the Bible, sin passes generation to generation. Every one of us is going to sin, and every one of us is going to be impacted by a world of sin. None of us get born into a world without it, right? Like when I was born into sin, or when I was born into a world that was already fallen. It's not like it resets at every generation. The world's just broken. This is what David talked about in Psalm 51:5 when he said, "Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me." Likewise, in Job 15, verse 14, Job is furious, he's angry, he's mad. He yells out to God at the top of his lungs and says, "What is man that he should be pure, or one born of woman that he should be righteous?" He goes on to say, "For can anything clean come from that which is unclean?" Ephesians chapter 2, verse 3. Could someone read Ephesians 2:3 for me? So many times, so many people in the Bible talk about how frustrated they are. They desperately want to be good, and yet they just can't seem to not sin. And they're so aggravated at themselves. By the way, never do I relate to someone more than in those moments, right? I can't tell you how many times I, on a weekly basis, do something stupid, immediately feel guilt for it. But then it's like next time I get in the same situation, I just can't seem to overcome my nature. Pride is my number one go-to, and I struggle with it all the time. It's like constantly right here in my ear, whispering to me, and I'm fighting against it. And I hate to tell you, but more times than not, it wins over me. All of us have that voice, whatever that voice is. And all of us have that sin, whatever that sin is. But why do we have it? Because we live in a fallen world. Ever since that moment, the world was different. One of the consequences that we see from sin is in Genesis chapter 3, verse 16. One that many of us are familiar with, but we should read it nonetheless. Page 2 there. Could someone read Genesis 3:16 for me?
To the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. In pain you shall deliver children, yet your desire will be for your husband. He shall rule over you.
Thank you. When we talk about these list of sin curses in Genesis 3, there's a whole list of them. God starts by talking to Satan, then he talks to woman, then he talks to man, then he talks to all of us. But in all of these, they're framed in one way. He gives a physical thing that represents something deeper, right? And so when he says pain in childbirth, he's not literally talking about the pain that happens when you give birth. Though that's there, that's not the ultimate part of the curse. We see this throughout it. Like, for instance, Genesis chapter 3, verse 14, a couple verses earlier. We're not going to read it. I'll summarize it. God looks at Satan, who is in the form of a serpent, and he says, you're going to lose your legs, and you're going to slither around on your belly. When I was a kid, I thought this was the weirdest curse of all time. So what, Satan just, like, all serpents lose their legs because Satan sinned? No. This isn't really an origin story of how snakes slither. It's something more than that. It's a physical representation. Now, did snakes lose their legs? Yeah, that's what it says. But that wasn't the ultimate curse. The ultimate curse was that Satan was going to be lower than dirt. And he was always going to be on the ground. This was God's metaphor. He gave a physical sign, losing of legs, to represent a spiritual truth. Satan is dust, and he's going to be under us forever. And just like a snake is always waiting to leap out and bite our ankles, as we see in Genesis chapter 3:18, that's exactly what Satan's doing. Waiting, slithering, waiting to strike. Top of page 3, we see this more laid out. We're not going to read it for time's sake. But the serpent losing of his legs in the list of sin curses is a representation of something greater, a loss of his prominence. Likewise, in the verse after the childbirth verse, God turns his attention to Adam, Genesis 3:17 and 18. And he says that the ground will be cursed and thistles and weeds will come up, and it'll make it hard to work. Again, this isn't, the ultimate consequence of sin isn't weeds, as annoying as they are, but it's a physical sign of something deeper. Work becomes unfulfilling. Life becomes vain. We toil and we toil and we toil, but there's always something more to toil about. It's what Solomon, the wisest man in the Bible, teaches us in Ecclesiastes. Vanity of vanity, says the teacher. Vanity of vanities. What do people gain from all the toil at which they toil under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. Again, the status, this symbol of weeds isn't just God saying, I've created weeds now. But it's saying that because of sin, our life will be difficult, unfruitful at times, and vain. Let's return back to childbearing, page 4. And then I'll stop here in just a second for questions. In every other portion of this list of curses, sin curses, the impact of sin is a physical sign with a signpost to a greater one. So what is the pain of childbirth? The answer is the word often translated travail. This is the Bible word given to child pains, and it's used throughout the rest of the Old Testament. It is a longing for something to be born, but the pain of the waiting, right? That's the metaphor. The waiting for that beautiful moment when the child comes into the earth, but the pain you're experiencing in that in-between. It is the embodiment of pain and hope, bitterness and relief, life being born out of sorrow. This is actually the word travail is the word used in Exodus when it talks about the people crying out in slavery. They weren't crying out in pain, but they were crying out in travail, in labor pains. A metaphor for knowing that there's life that's on the other side of the slavery they're trying to get to, but the bitterness of the moment they find themselves in. This word, travail, this image of child pain, isn't literally just the pain that women feel in childbirth, which, by the way, legit, very real, and not fun. I'm not saying it's not. But it's symbolic of something greater. The agony of the in-between. Between Eve and the moment when Eve no longer is Eve, but woman once again. The moment between brokenness and healing. Before we move on here, I've covered a lot in quick succession. Do you guys have any questions that you'd like to ask? Any thoughts that this brings up? Sorry about the sniffles. I'm trying really hard to turn my head when I'm sniffling so it's not right in the mic. The people online are super uncomfortable right now. Every 2 seconds. Okay, no questions? Awesome. Let's keep rocking and rolling. Okay, so the Jews in the time of Jesus had a book that they had in their Old Testament that isn't in our Bible today, and there's a lot of reasons and we don't have time to get into it, but they called it Second Esdras, or Second Ezra. The reason it's not in our Bibles today, I will give just a caveat, is because there really wasn't a lot of reason to add it. The Old Testament that the Jews used had 80-something books. We cut a lot of those because they're very repetitive. They just kind of say the same things over and over. And so instead of making the Bible 140-something books long, they kind of took the most important ones and used those. But this is one that Jesus quoted a lot out of. Like, for instance, for those of you who are familiar with the story in Matthew 23, where after he lays into the Pharisees, one of my favorite passages in Scripture, by the way, he goes crazy with these 7 woes. It's like the equivalent of an Eminem diss tape Bible version. And he at the end of it comes out, backs up, and then he looks out and he starts crying. I don't believe I dropped Eminem diss tape in a Bible class. There we are. So he backs up out of it, and in this moment he is overwhelmed with sorrow and sadness because the people that he loves don't love him back. And so he says this line. He says, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, that you would be like my chicks and I could be your mother hen and put you under my wing." That's a direct quotation out of 2 Ezra 1:30. Likewise, in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he relays to his apostles the moment he's frustrated, he's been praying and weeping and sad, he comes to them and the apostles are asleep and he kicks them up and he says, "Do you not know that my soul is greatly grieved and my soul is unto death?" Again, a quotation from 2 Ezra. The reason I want to bring this up is because 2 Ezra has a lot of poetry that Jesus uses in his lifetime, including the pain of childbirth. In 2 Ezra 4, verses 40 through 42, specifically one line in this I want to read. "In Sheol, or the place of the dead, the chambers of the soul are likened to a fetus in the womb. For just as a woman who is in labor makes haste to escape the pangs of birth, so also do these places hasten to give back those things who were committed to them." What is he saying? Childbirth is a metaphor for death. The moment that souls die, and they know that they should be cleansed, they know that they should be made whole, but in the moment they're trapped in the waiting. In many ways, for centuries until Christ came, the whole world was in this waiting. All the Jews that died before lived in Sheol, waiting and waiting and waiting for the coming of Christ to find forgiveness in the agony of the not yet. Does that make sense? That's where we are now. The agony of the not yet. Knowing there's a hope of heaven coming, but not there yet. In the meantime, we have to deal with dumb things like sniffles and really dumb things like cancer, loss of loved ones, sorrow, anxiety, and pain. The already not yet and the tension in between. The metaphor for childbirth. Let's flip over to page 5. And let's pivot from one woman to the next of our 3. There was a woman in the Bible who actually receives the name the woman of travail, who perfectly represents that pain of the in-between. Her name is a lot of things. The mother of Israel is what she's called, or the mourner of Ephrathah, the woman in travail, but her most common name is Rachel, the mother of Joseph and the wife of Jacob, the man who, by the way, got the name Israel. Rachel, for the majority of her life, desperately wanted one thing: kids. In a society that gave women their worth and value based on their fruitfulness, she, being barren, left her lonely, sad, and forgotten. What's even worse is that her husband loved her more than anyone else. Jacob had 2 wives, as you'll recall, Rachel and Leah, who were sisters. And though Leah gave birth to child after child after child after child after child, Rachel, the one that he actually loved the most, couldn't seem to give birth. And so she prayed and she prayed and she prayed and she prayed and she prayed, and finally God bestowed her a child, Joseph. And as soon as Joseph took his first breath, he became the favorite child because obviously that was the son of the one that he loved. In fact, God even took notice of Joseph and gave him special visions. Bottom of page 5 there, we'll see Genesis chapter 37, verses 9 through 11. One of these visions that he dreams. Can someone read it for me, please?
And he dreamed another dream, and told to his brothers, and said, Behold, I have dreamed another dream. And behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me. But when he told to his father and his father rebuked him and said, What is this dream and what dream? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come and bow ourselves to the ground before you? And his brothers were jealous of him. But his father kept the saying to himself.
Thank you. So the dream was as follows. Joseph, one night, woke up by the way, in Thursday school, we do like a story time. And this was one of the stories that we had a little video that we showed the kids. And it made me laugh out loud so hard because like in the middle of the night, everyone's sleeping. And in the video, Joseph just goes running around with 2 pans and just like wakes everyone up and then like pronounces his dream and everyone like throws things at him and he goes back to bed. Goofy as it is, it's actually kind of accurate. Over and over the course of about a week, Joseph kept waking up his brothers, conveying these dreams that God were giving him, and all of them were the same. He was going to be elevated above the rest of the family. He was going to be greater than Jacob. He was going to be greater than his brothers, and he was going to be greater even than his mother, Rachel. And not only that, but each one of them got different symbols. Stars, the stars were the brothers, the sun was the father, and the moon was the mother. And though there's a lot to unpack here, the point is that this symbolizes the role that Joseph would have for the future. That Joseph wasn't going to be forgotten. He was going to have a special place, and so too would his dad and his mom, Rachel. Rachel would be remembered for future generations. But what would she be remembered for? Sadly, nothing positive. She was always defined by her suffering, her plight, her desire to have kids, and the fact that she couldn't. Top of page 6, we see this played out. Even after she gave birth to Joseph, it seemed that it wasn't enough for her. I've always wondered why Leah and Rachel were so different in the way they named their kids. Every name that Leah named her kids was things like, God be blessed, praise be to God, we have a wonderful kid. And Rachel's kids are things like, God has taken away my reproach. That was the most positive of the names that she gave her kids. She was bitter. She was lonely. And she was scared. But she's most remembered for the last thing she ever did. Genesis chapter 35, verses 16 through 20, Rachel is on the move, trying to make it home to Bethel in order to give birth to a kid, Benjamin. And while she was still away from Bethel, she passed a place called Ephrathah, which we now later know as Bethlehem. And on her way, she needed to go into labor immediately. So they pulled over into the city of Ephrathah, and she travailed, it says. She was in harsh pain. And as she gave birth, the midwife grabbed the child and smiled and said, "Fear not, for you will have another son." We see that in verse 17. But her soul was departing. She was dying. She called the child Benoni, which is another negative, very negative name, to which immediately the midwife said, "Oh, I'm sorry, did you say Benjamin? That's a great name," and changed it. But ultimately, Rachel died there in Ephrathah and was buried, forever getting the name the woman of travail, the woman who never experienced the promise, the woman who died before she could experience the child. And as sad as this motif is, it's actually a very profound one that the poets use often, looking back at that moment. The moment when the woman never got to experience the joy she held for, the hope that she had, but died before she could ever accomplish it. This tomb of Ephrathah, by the way, became like one of the most important places in Israel. People from all over the world would come and visit Ephrathah, the tomb of Ephrathah, because this was the place where the woman of travail was laid to rest. Not only that, but women who wanted to have children would come and fall before her grave and pray and pray and pray, believing it was a place where God would hear them. Not only that, but even the psalmist in Psalm 132 believed that there was a presence here at the tomb of Ephrathah that you could go to and God would hear your cries. As David writes, "I will not give sleep to my eyes or slumber to my eyelids until I find a place of the Lord, a dwelling place for the mighty one of Jacob. And lo, we heard of it in Ephrathah and found it in the fields of Jaar." This place of Ephrathah became like a holy site for the Jews. In fact, we see 5 of the prophets making pilgrimages to Ephrathah to be in the presence of Rachel, the woman of travail. And I think it's interesting that they made that trip because they could relate to Rachel. They couldn't relate to the childbirth or the dying in childbirth, but they could all relate to the feeling of hoping for something so desperately and never seeing it come to fruition. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, all of the prophets constantly were pointing ahead to the hope of tomorrow, the hope of tomorrow, the hope of tomorrow, knowing they would never see it, that they would die long before relief. The already not yet, the travail, the hope, and the bitterness. This place of Ephrathah became a metaphor that people would use all the time. Great women like Ruth were given the title of Rachel. And their homes were to be blessed like Ephrathah. But perhaps the most amazing moment is page 7 here. Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 15 through 17, a prophecy that the prophet Jeremiah says on behalf of Rachel, the woman in travail. Can someone please read for me Jeremiah 31, 15 through 17, please?
Thus says the Lord, voice is heard thereon, lamentations and bitter weeping. Rachel is weeping for her children, she refuses to be comforted for her children, because they are not. But God says, keep your voice from weeping, and your eyes from tears. For your work shall be rewarded, says the Lord, and they shall come back from the land of the enemy. There is hope for your future, says the Lord, and your children shall come back to their own place.
The Jews believed that the woman of travail, Rachel, wept and petitioned always. In fact, almost every single time she's mentioned in the prophets, she's mentioned crying on behalf of her people. The metaphor of Rachel became something permanent. Every time Israel was struggling, Rachel was crying. Every time they were in slavery, she was praying. Every time that they were hurting, she was hurting. And God here uses that as a reference point, where he's having this conversation with Rachel. Rachel's weeping, begging God, protect my children, protect my children. And God is saying, don't worry, it's coming. In this moment, God takes the role of the midwife, grabbing the hand of the woman in travail, saying, it's almost over. Just keep pushing, we're almost done. Life is on the other side. It is within this context that we get one last prophecy, and then I'll wrap it all up. Page 8, we're going to skip all the green stuff there because, boy howdy, is it deep stuff that isn't super relevant unless you're a nerd like me. But if you are a nerd like me, you should read it. It's cool. I got way too deep. I don't know if y'all do this. I'm kind of an obsessive guy. Like, for those of you who know, I'm really big into like fantasy football. I worked for a fantasy football company for a while as like a side gig where I would write articles. And it happened so fast. I was in one league and I was like, oh, this is fun. And then 2 leagues. This is really fun. And then I had 15 spreadsheets of every player and their 10-year trajectory and was coming up with equations and writing articles. And I realized, what happened here? It's kind of what happened in this class. Actually, it's what happens in most classes. But anyway, top page 8. M&M and fantasy football. Micah chapter 5. Can someone please read for me verses 2 through 4? Top page 8, sorry, that's on me.
But you, O Bethlehem, Ephraim, you are little among the clans of Judah. From you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler of Israel, whose full origin is from old and ancient of days. Therefore he shall give them up until the time when she who is in travail has brought forth. Then the rest of his brethren shall return to the people of Israel, and he shall stand and feed his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. And they shall dwell secure, for now he shall be great in the ends of the earth.
Here we see a prophecy offered. A prophecy and a promise to Rachel. Just wait. Just hold on. Your childbearing is coming to an end. The hope is going to be restored, and a ruler that will come. A man who will lead Israel like a shepherd leads a flock, like a king of David. And he's going to do some incredible things. We see a reference to Ephrathah, the woman in travail, the coming of a child, and all of these things. But all of these things represent travail. This is what God was talking about in his curse to Eve. Not just the 6 to 8 hour owies that happen when you're giving birth, but a life of intense owies. Madison, I'm sorry. I love you. Boy, howdy. But this is, well, I don't know how long it actually is supposed to go, because Madison's first one went 72 hours, and the next one went 1 hour and 14 minutes. So somewhere in that timeline. But the point is that that's what travail was always supposed to be about. The reality that all of us as humans are waiting for a hope, waiting for a hope, waiting for a hope that just seems to be right out of reach. And a hope that many of us, like the Jews before, may not see. We may not see Jesus coming back in glory, the clouds rolled back and him coming down with his army of angels. But there will come a point when all of us will see Jesus, and we will see the hope that we have labored for. So, the second woman, the first, Eve, this one, Rachel, the representation of suffering. And now we're going to pivot to our third and final. Just kind of a drop in the bucket for where we're going to end up next week. This prophecy that was written in Micah was not just a reference to the Son, Jesus, that was going to come, but also a prophecy of Mary, the woman who would give birth to him. This is important, mind you, because even Micah is drawing a comparison that the woman of travail is about to give birth. So it's fitting that in Matthew chapter 2, Mary, whose name means, don't know if you remember this from like 4 weeks ago, bitterness or travail, is the one who's going to give birth to a child. She is the one who's going to put an end to the longing and the hope of Rachel. In Matthew chapter 2, verses 16 through 21, Matthew, the author here, actually quotes Micah chapter 5. In verse 17, he uses that exact text to show that Mary is the fulfillment of it. That all of the laboring, all of the crying, all of the weeping, all of the hopelessness that Rachel felt through decades and decades of watching Israel stumble and fall, the way that she died before she ever saw the hope that she was living for, all of these things fulfilled in one crucial moment, the moment that a child's voice cried out in the middle of a cave outside of Ephrathah, Bethlehem, the place where Jesus was born. And just as Rachel experienced travail for her people because of foreign powers wanting to kill them, so too Mary had to experience the same thing as Herod tried to kill Jesus right at his birth, and she was forced to flee with the child to Egypt. We see, top of page 9, that Rachel is the weeping mother, and Mary is also the fulfillment of that. We see how the story of Ephrathah finds its fulfillment. Notice the way it goes full circle. The woman of travail dies in Ephrathah, Bethlehem, giving birth to a child she'll never get to meet for a hope that she'll never get to experience. And in that same place, in a cave not much further than the one that Benjamin was born in, everything Rachel lived and died for came to fruition. I find it so amazing that that was the city that she had to stop at immediately, right? It's just one of those God moments. She was on the road, and she had to go into labor right then, right where Jesus would be born. She didn't know it. No one did. But now we can look back and go, wow, that's amazing. Not only that, but the New Testament continues to draw this comparison over and over again. The woman of travail finding her fulfillment in Mary. To use the words that we used earlier, the type, the woman of travail, pointing ahead like a signpost to Mary, the one who would fulfill the suffering and bring it to its conclusion. Not only that, but this is where the Bible just completely blows my mind every time. You remember that random vision in Genesis that Joseph had? The prophecy about how Joseph would be on top of the sun, the moon, and the stars, and how that proved that Rachel was going to be remembered. So would Joseph. Page 9 there's a Revelation 12, a vision that John has. And I want you to notice what it says here. Follow along with me. And a great portent, that's just a fancy way of saying a sign, appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And she was with child, and she cried out in the pangs of birth, in travail for delivery. This is setting up a very clear image Rachel in heaven, giving birth, crowned with the stars of her son's dream, standing on top of the moon with the sun around her. The fulfillment of what Joseph prophesied all those years ago coming to fruition. But as we'll see as we continue on in Revelation 12 next week, it wasn't Rachel that John saw. It's what he thought he saw, because that's why he started drawing the image. But then the woman gives birth, and it wasn't to Joseph or Benjamin, but it was to Jesus, the one who would rule the nations with an iron fist. Here the woman is the woman in travail, Mary, the end of our hurt and pain because of what she was going to give birth to, the one who would make it all worth it. The hope of generations of Jews who lived and died in slavery and exile, dying on battlefields and being oppressed and killed, coming to fruition in a cave outside of Ephrathah. As Rachel weeps no more, because finally the child has come, the hope of humanity. As we end tonight, I'm going to end here in John 19, bottom of page 9. Thanks for hanging with me, guys. I know we just covered like 1,000 years of Jewish history, like lickety-split, but well done. John chapter 19, at the end of page 9 there, Jesus is on the cross and he's dying. And he brings this relationship to its end. Again, I sometimes we how do I put this? I don't want to say anything. We struggle as Christians to find the balance of what it meant that Jesus was God and man, right? We struggle with that. It's complex. But one of the things I think we really struggle with is that Jesus experienced all of the pain of the cross like a human would, right? And in that moment, amidst the agony, he still had his eyes on the hope of humanity. And he was still bringing together the Bible. Little things like when he said, "It is finished," the last lines, by the way, of the Torah, bringing it to conclusion. Or in this moment, as we're about to read, when he makes the conscious effort while he's dying on a cross to make sure people don't miss the Rachel imagery in the moment. Or when he drinks the wine from the hyssop on the sponge as a reference to the Passover. Jesus, in all of his agony, understood the mission he had before him and had enough of a level head to be able to continue to draw the comparisons we need today. Which, by the way, unbelievable. But John chapter 19, Jesus is sitting there and he's on the cross and he looks out and he sees Mary, his mom. And beside her is the beloved disciple, that is John. And he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." And then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her to his own home. When I first read this story, it was very simple to me, at least I thought so. And I thought to myself, okay, so Jesus is worried about his mom and he's worried about his youngest apostle, so he's going to put them together. That makes sense. Until you read the whole context of the crucifixion and you realize that John's mother, biological mother, was there, right beside them. So why would Jesus tell Mary to adopt a child whose mother is right there beside them? And not only that, but what does all this have to do? Why did Jesus not refer to her by her name, Mary? Why instead did he call her woman? Another odd turn of events. And even more, why did he tell John to take care of the mother? John at this point was under 18, probably closer to 15. Why would he ask this teenager to take care of Mary? There's so much about this story that doesn't make sense until we realize that maybe he wasn't referencing a physical adoption at all. Maybe he was bringing an end to the story of Rachel. Remember, Rachel died giving birth to her second child, right? And it was through the giving birth of her second child that she became the woman of travail who died. Mary, like Rachel, had a child, Joseph, and in her case, Jesus. Both of them were the special children, right? Mary's first child and Rachel's first child. But just as Rachel experienced travail in her giving of the second child, Mary undid it by accepting her second child. In that moment when Mary symbolically adopted John, she's symbolically adopting Israel. new Israel, the church. She's symbolically adopting every future generation of those who are to come. This is Jesus' way of saying, hey, as Rachel was the mother of old Israel, now you are the mother of new Israel. This is his way of saying, Rachel's travail is done, and here is your child. This time, not going to die in your arms. You're not going to die in his arms, but rather will live for future generations to trust. This moment is the coup de grace, it's the conclusion of the narrative, as Jesus once and for all pronounces a new mother of travail, this time not dying in her pain, but bringing hope. This time not failing to see her kid, but holding him in her arms. John would go on, by the way, for those of you who want to know, John and Mary lived together in Ephesus until she died. And then eventually he was exiled into an island of Patmos where he wrote Revelation and ultimately died. That relationship they had was very, very special. It's one of the reasons why in the Gospel of John we get some really beautiful, intimate stories between Jesus and his mother. He knew them because he heard them. But at the end of his life, John had a sermon, and he talks about the things that he saw with his own hands, or saw with his eyes and felt with his hands. And he remembered the moments like this, the moments when the Bible came together for him, the moments when God tied it all together. What's interesting is the early church reflects often John calling Mary Rachel as a term of endearment. Why? Because she was everything Rachel was, a woman of travail, but a woman who got to see the hope. Not like Rachel, who died before she could, but being able to hold the Son of God who would save us all in her arms. The entire Bible that we've been talking about for weeks, from the Ark of Noah to the burning bush, can be told in these women. If you notice, these are the same three women we keep coming back to over and over again. Mary, Eve, and Rachel. Eve, the woman who represents our brokenness and our failure, from the position of woman to Eve. Rachel, the symbol of our unrealized hope and the pain of the generations that wait and wait and wait. And Mary, the fulfillment of the promise, the one who makes it all worth it again. This week was a lot of history and a lot of Bible. Next week's going to be more practical as we conclude our series on this, as we see Mary taking the role of woman once again. It's not an accident that Jesus begins and ends his ministry with the same word, woman. John 2 at the wedding of Cana, he addresses his mother. It's one of the first things we hear him say, woman, and he ends his life with the same phrase. Realizing that thousands of years later, he never gave up on the identity that humans were supposed to have. We've betrayed him and hurt him for millennia, constantly falling short. And yet God never lost sight of what we were supposed to be. He kept the image of Eve in his head, the Eve he knew, the Eve he made, until that moment he said it again on the cross. In that moment, I can only imagine what Jesus was thinking as he was hanging there dying for mankind, and through closed eyes said the name of the first woman all the way back in Genesis, as a way of fully reminding us that it is truly finished. The sin of Eve, undone in the cross of Calvary. And now, all of us can find our way out of the travail of the waiting and into the hope of the gospel. That's where we'll pick up next week as we conclude our series together. Thank you guys so much for your attention tonight. I know it was a bit dense. And thank you for your whole time with me this journey together. Is there any questions that we have as we conclude out tonight? Yeah. Sure, fire away. Wait, the Halloween one? Okay, cool. Changing gears. Okay, I'm back. Oh, thank you.
So the scripture when they talk about the great love of the
Yeah, Hebrews 12:1.
does that mean that people who've gone before us can see that?
What a fun question. I'm not going to pretend to be the expert on this. This is one of the most contentious points of Christianity. A lot of people disagree on this. A lot of people fight about it. I will say, at risk of sounding flippant, Jesus has a line that he says to the Pharisees, make sure you don't strain a gnat and then swallow the camel. Basically, don't get too bogged down in things that we can't fully know. I'll give you Bishop Darby's, 100% Bishop Darby's opinion on this. To be clear, the Bible is ambiguous. So this is Bishop Darby's opinion on this. I'm just saying this again. Revelation 7 is one of the biggest passages I use for my understanding of how the dead view what's going on. I don't think they see everything that's happening. I don't think their view of time is the same as ours. I think when you're in the presence of God, that time is a very different concept. With that being said, it does say in Revelation 7 that the saints, those who had gone before us, carry in their arms the incense, which represents the prayers of the church. So to some degree, they have some engagement with what's happening. Again, I don't think like right now someone's like watching me give this lesson, but I do think that they are aware of the broad strokes of what's happening in the church. And again, I think it ties back to what we talked about in that class, that we have this mindset almost that when you die, you go on like eternal vacation, or that like you don't find yourself as a part of the church anymore. The Bible's very clear that death isn't an end. It's just a continuation. And so I'm a big believer that if we're a part of the kingdom on earth, of God on earth, then we're still going to be a part of the kingdom of God in heaven. I don't know what that looks like, though. So do I think they're looking down on us? To some degree, yes. Whatever that looks like in detail, I have my thoughts, but I don't have any concrete evidence. Again, Revelation 7 is a good place, I think, to go. Also, Hebrews 12, that passage you just referenced, where he lists all these people, and then he says, you're surrounded by them as you're walking in faith. So to some degree, yes, we are supported and upheld by those who've gone before us. I wish I could give you more of a concrete answer, but I don't think there is one to give. At least confidently. There's opinions, but I try to stay away from those if I can. Yes. To me, that's what matters. And I think we get a glimpse of that in Jesus's parable of Lazarus and the rich man, where Lazarus is on the lap of Abraham, right? And he's being comforted. And then the rich man who is in Hades' torment calls out and says, "Can I go tell my brothers?" Which indicates that he still has an awareness that they're not living right. So to some degree, he knew what they were experiencing. But to what degree he could do anything about it, I don't know. But the image of the cloud of witnesses, knowing that like I am carrying on the faith, and beside me walks Abraham and Moses and Peter, and that my prayers and the prayers of the church today matter to them too, is humbling and terrifying. Because I have some big shoes to fill. We all do. And sometimes I don't know if we're filling them the way they should be. Anybody else have any thoughts? Thank you guys so much. I appreciate y'all. Have a good night.